The Canterville Ghost. Mr. Hiram Otis was an American minister from New York. He came to England to live and work, but he didn't want to stay in London. Instead, he preferred to live in the countryside, away from the city. Canterville Chase was a big and old house near London. Its owner, Lord Canterville, wished to sell it. Therefore, Mr. Otis paid a visit to Lord Canterville. Lord Canterville, a very honorable man, thought it was important to warn Mr. Otis about the ghost. When they talked about the terms of the sale, "We haven't wanted to live in that place ourselves," Lord Canterville explained. "Ever since my grandaunt, the Dowager Duchess of Bolton, got scared and never fully recovered, when two skeleton hands were placed on her shoulders as she was getting ready for dinner. I must inform you, Mr. Otis, that the ghost has been seen by many members of my family. Since the Duchess's unfortunate incident, none of our younger servants would stay, and Lady Canterville often had trouble sleeping due to mysterious noises in the corridor and library." "Sir," said Mr. Otis, "I will buy the furniture and the ghost for a price. I come from a modern country where we can buy anything with money." "I believe there is a real ghost," said Lord Canterville with a smile. "It's been known for 3 centuries, since 1584. It always appears before someone in our family dies, even if your organizers haven't been able to prove it. Well, the family doctor also predicts deaths, Lord Canterville. But there's no such thing as a ghost, sir. I believe the laws of nature don't change, even for the British nobleman." Lord Canterville replied to Mr. Otis, "You seem quite comfortable in America. If you're okay with having a ghost in the house, that's fine. Just remember, I gave you a warning." A few weeks later, the purchase was completed, and at the end of the season, the minister and his family traveled to Canterville Chase. He was married to a woman named Lucretia, and had 3 sons and a daughter. Mrs. Otis, once a famous lady in New York, was now a respectable middle-aged woman, with beautiful eyes. The eldest son, named Washington, was a handsome young man with fair hair. He had prepared himself for a career in American diplomacy. His ability as an exceptional dancer was recognized even in London. He had 2 younger brothers who were twins, both 12 years old. And his sister, Virginia, was 15, with beautiful large blue eyes and a lovely face. Mr. Otis brought his family to live at Canterville Chase, an old house in the countryside west of London. They traveled from London by train, and then rode to the house in a wagon pulled by 2 horses. An old woman, neatly dressed in black silk with a white apron, welcomed Mr. Otis and his family to Canterville Chase. Mrs. Umney, the housekeeper, had been asked to stay on, at Lady Canterville's request. She bowed to them as they arrived and said, in an old-fashioned way, "Welcome to Canterville Chase." They followed her inside through a large hall into the library, A long room with black oak walls and a large stained glass window. Tea was ready for them, and after taking off their coats, they sat down to explore the room, while Mrs. Umney served them. Mrs. Otis suddenly noticed a dark red spot on the floor, near the fireplace. Unaware of its real meaning, she said to Mrs. Umney, "I'm afraid something has been spilled there." "Yes, madam," replied the old housekeeper in a low voice. "Blood has been spilled on that spot." "How horrible," said Mrs. Otis. "I don't like to see any spots of blood in a sitting room. It must be removed at once." The old woman smiled, and answered in a deep, mysterious voice, "It is the blood of Lady Eleanor de Canterville, who was murdered by her own husband, Sir Simon de Canterville, in 1575. Sir Simon lived for 9 more years, but then disappeared under very mysterious circumstances. His body was never found, but his guilty ghost still haunts the chase. The bloodstain has been admired by many visitors, and cannot be removed." "That's all nonsense," cried Washington Otis. "Pinkerton's Champion Stain Remover and Detergent will clean it up in no time." And before the frightened housekeeper could speak, he had fallen to his knees and was rapidly scrubbing the floor. In a few moments there was no trace of the blood stain. Mrs. Umney looked at the floor. She was frightened. No one had removed the blood stain for 300 years. Mrs. Umney was very frightened. "Pinkertons can remove anything," said Washington Otis. "The blood stain has gone." Lightning flashed and lit the library. Thunder crashed over the house. Mrs. Umney fainted. Mr. and Mrs. Otis ran across the library. They helped the old housekeeper, who lay on the floor. Mrs. Umney had her eyes closed, and her face was pale. Mrs. Otis screamed, "Mrs. Umney! Mrs. Umney! Are you able to speak?" Mrs. Umney blinked her eyes open. "There will be trouble in this house," she said. "I saw the ghost. The ghost will come to you." Mrs. Umney was lifted to her feet by all of the Otises. "The ghost will come," she murmured once again. "Do not try to remove the blood stain. You aren't allowed to clean the library floor. The ghost will be angry." Mrs. Umney then walked upstairs to her room. "Let's look for the ghost," the Otis boys suggested. "Let's have a look around the house." The Otises looked around the home as a group. They did not, however, see the Canterville ghost. One stormy night, there was a big storm, but nothing special happened. The next morning at breakfast, the blood stain was back on the floor. Washington tried cleaning it, but it kept coming back. Even when the library was locked, the stain returned. The family got interested, and Mr. Otis started to think maybe he was wrong about ghosts. Mrs. Otis wanted to join a ghost study group, and Washington wrote a letter about bloodstains and crime. That night, they became sure that ghosts were real. The day was warm and sunny, and in the evening, the family went out for a drive. They returned home at 9 o'clock and had a light supper. The conversation was about everyday topics, like actors, food, and cities. They didn't talk about ghosts, or mention Sir Simon de Canterville. At 11 o'clock the family went to bed, and at 12:30 all the lights were turned off. Later, Mr. Otis heard a strange sound outside his room. He checked the time and it was 1 o'clock. Despite the strange sound, he felt calm and not nervous. The sound continued, followed by footsteps. Mr. Otis put on his slippers, took a small bottle from his dressing case, and opened the door. In the moonlight, he saw an old man, with red eyes, long gray hair, dirty clothes, and heavy chains around his wrists and ankles. "My dear sir," said Mr. Otis, "I really must insist that you oil those chains. I have brought you for that purpose, a small bottle of oil. It works well, with just one application, and there are testimonials from some important people on the package. I will leave it here for you, by the candles in the bedroom, and will be glad to supply you with more should you need it." With these words the United States minister placed the bottle on a marble table and, closing his door, he went to sleep. For a moment the Canterville ghost stood motionless in natural indignation. Then throwing the bottle violently to the floor, he escaped down the corridor, making a loud groan and glowing a horrible green light. But just as he reached the top of the great oak staircase, a door was opened. Two little figures in white appeared, and a large pillow went past his head. The Canterville ghost was confused and didn't know what to do. Finally, he disappeared through the wall, and the house fell silent. The ghost returned to his secret room, sat down, and thought about the recent events. For 300 years he had frightened people. He peered through windows, frightened servants, knocked on bedroom doors, and caused fear in people's beds. He blew out candles in the dark and made scary noises with his chains. All this time, everyone had always been afraid. No one had ever offered him rising sun oil for his chains, and no one had ever thrown pillows at him. He was an incredibly unhappy ghost. The next morning, the Otis family gathered for breakfast and discussed the ghost at length. He expressed his concern for the ghost and suggested that if it refused to use the rising sun lubricator, its chains should be taken away, as the noise outside the bedrooms was disturbing. For the rest of the week, they were undisturbed except for the continuous reappearance of the bloodstain on the library floor. The color of the bloody spot changed each time, amusing the family, but upsetting little Virginia, who almost cried when it turned emerald green. The second appearance of the ghost took place on Sunday night. An old suit of armor fell, and the Canterville ghost was found sitting in a chair, apparently in pain. The twins shot pellets at him, with pea shooters, and Mr. Otis pointed his gun, and told the ghost to raise his hands. The ghost disappeared, leaving them in the dark. Mrs. Otis, thinking the ghost was unwell, came up with a remedy. Concerned, Mrs. Otis offered, "Are you in pain? I have a bottle of Dr. Dobell's medicine. It's good for stomach aches and headaches. Please take the medicine." The ghost glared at Mrs. Otis angrily. Then the ghost ran up the stairs in the darkness. He stopped at the top of the stairs and laughed. He had a frightening laugh. Men's hair had turned gray when they heard him laugh. But the Otises were not afraid. Then he disappeared in a green cloud and went back to his secret room. He was very unhappy. He had tried to put on the suit of armor, but it was too heavy. The armor had fallen over and the ghost had hurt his leg. After recovering from days of illness, the ghost decided to make a third attempt to scare the United States minister and his family. He chose Friday, August 17th, a stormy night, his favorite, provided the perfect setting. His plan involved quietly reaching Washington Otis's room, then his main target. That was Washington, who regularly removed the Canterville bloodstain. As for little Virginia, he hadn't decided how to frighten her but considered a few hollow groans sufficient. The twins, however, were in for a lesson. He would sit on their chests, create a nightmare sensation, and then take on the role of the suicide skeleton to instill fear with white bones and one rolling eyeball. At 10:30, he heard the family going to bed. The Otis family slept, unaware, and above the rain and storm, he heard the steady snoring of Mr. Otis. Stepping out with an evil smile, he passed the window, where his arms and those of his murdered wife were displayed. Moving silently like a spooky shadow. Finally, he came to the hallway that led to Washington's room. Pausing for a moment, his long gray hair blowing in the wind, he felt it was time to make his move. With a mysterious laugh he turned the corner, but suddenly he turned back in fear and let out a loud scream. Right in front of him stood a terrifying figure, as still as a statue, but as frightening as the wildest nightmare. The ghost had a shiny bald head and a round, fat, white face that seemed to be frozen in an evil smile. Its eyes shot red beams of light, its mouth was like a hole of fire, and it wore clothing similar to the ghost's own. On its chest was a shield, with strange old writing, perhaps telling tales of terrible crimes, or a list of terrible murders. And in his right hand he held a shining, sharp sword. Since he had never encountered a ghost before, it was natural for him to feel extremely scared. After taking a quick look at the terrifying phantom, he hurriedly ran back to his room. After some time, though, his brave nature returned, and he decided to go and talk to the other ghost, as soon as it was daylight. Just as the sun was rising, he made his way back to where he had first seen the ghostly figure, thinking that two ghosts were better than one, and that with his new friend's help, he could face the twins without fear. The second ghost was still there, but its eyes were no longer burning. He went up to it. He touched it. The head of the second ghost fell onto the floor. It was not a ghost at all. It was a head made from a large round vegetable, called a pumpkin. The twins had put a candle inside it. There was a card on the floor. The Otis Ghost. The only true Canterville ghost. He figured out that he was tricked. The ghost, feeling upset and angry, tired and frustrated, the ghost gave up and went back to his room. The next day, the ghost was very weak and tired. His nerves were on edge, and even the slightest noise made him jump. For 5 days he kept his room, and at last made up his mind to give up on scaring the Otis family with the blood-stained library floor. If the Otis family did not want it, they clearly did not deserve it. The family seemed to be focused on material things, and couldn't understand the deeper meaning behind his ghostly appearances. However, he couldn't ignore his duty to appear in the corridor and frighten people. So, for the next few weeks, he continued his haunting routine, taking extra care not to be seen or heard. He even borrowed Mr. Otis's bottle of Rising Sun lubricator to oil his chains and avoid any unwanted sounds. But despite his efforts, he still faced many challenges. The mischievous twins set traps for him, causing him to slip and fall. This made him furious, and he decided to take one final effort. Deciding to make one more attempt to scare the Otis twins, he made a plan to make his face look as terrifying as possible. He patiently waited until the middle of the night to carry out his creepy plan. He walked slowly and silently toward the twins' bedroom. The clock was struck 1 in the morning, and the house was silent. The door to the twins' room, slightly open, caught his attention. To frighten the twins, the ghost removed his head and carried it under his arm, a truly frightening sight. He carefully pushed the door open, but it unexpectedly bumped into the wall. His plan was to scream while holding the head in his hands, creating a terrifying scene. However, a trick played by the twins caused a heavy jug of water to fall on him as the door opened. Soaked and surprised, the ghost moved back down the corridor. Instead of being frightened, the twins started laughing. The ghost realized that he couldn't scare the twins or anyone else in the Otis family. Washington Otis stepped out of his bedroom, and the ghost froze. The twins quickly caught up and ran down the hall. With joy on their faces, they shouted "Boo!" into the ghost's ears and waved their arms. Washington Otis found the whole situation amusing and couldn't help but laugh at the ghost's expense. After being frightened by the twins, the ghost tried to escape, but ended up hiding in an unlit stove. He made his way back to his room through the chimneys, and decided not to go out at night anymore. The twins kept trying to scare him, but he refused to come out. Life at Canterville Chase returned to normal, with Mr. Otis working on the history of the Democratic Party, Mrs. Otis organizing events, and the children playing games. People assumed the ghost had left, and Mr. Otis wrote a letter to Lord Canterville, who expressed his happiness and congratulated the minister's wife. Although the Otis family thought the ghost had left, he remained hidden in the house, but his health had worsened. A few days later, Virginia and her friend went horseback riding. She tore her dress, so when they returned, she used the back stairs to avoid being seen. To her surprise, it was the Canterville ghost, looking sad. He was sitting by the window watching the leaves fall. Virginia, feeling sorry for him, decided to comfort him. The ghost was so lost in thought that he didn't notice her until she spoke, expressing her sympathy and offering comfort. "I am so sorry for you," said Virginia quietly. "I apologize for my brothers not being very kind to you. However, you did make an effort to scare them." "Yes, I did," replied the ghost. "It is my job to frighten everyone who comes to Canterville Chase." "You shouldn't have such a reason to exist," said Virginia. "Mrs. Umney, the housekeeper, told us that you killed your wife." "Yes, I did it," said the ghost, sounding annoyed, but it was a family matter and didn't concern anyone else. "It is very wrong to kill anyone," said Virginia. "But she wasn't very kind," said sad the ghost. "But it doesn't matter now. It's all in the past. I don't think it was very kind of her brothers to let me starve to death, even though I did cause her death." "Starve you to death?" "Oh, Mr. Ghost, I mean Sir Simon, are you hungry? I have a sandwich in my case. Would you like it?" "No, thank you. I never eat anything now, but it is very kind of you. All the same, and you are much nicer than the rest of your family. They are rude, nasty and unkind." "Stop!" cried Virginia. "You are rude and unkind too. You stole my paint box. You used my paints to make the bloodstain in the library. I never told anyone about it." "Good evening, Mr. Ghost," Virginia said angrily. She turned to go, but the ghost spoke again. "Please don't go, Miss Virginia," he cried. "I am so lonely and so unhappy, and I really don't know what to do. I want to go to sleep and I cannot." "It's easy to sleep," said Virginia. "You go to bed and close your eyes." "I have not slept for 300 years, he said sadly, and Virginia's beautiful blue eyes opened in wonder. "For 300 years I have not slept, and I am so tired." She came toward him, and kneeling at his side, looked up into his old face. It was a sad face. "Poor ghost," said Virginia. "How can I help you? Have you no place where you can sleep?" "Far away in the woods," said the ghost, "there is a garden, where the grass grew long, adorned with beautiful flowers and trees. In this magical place, a nightingale sang throughout the night, and the cold crystal moon cast its gentle light. The garden was watched over by a giant tree, its branches spreading out protectively over the peaceful sleepers below. Virginia's eyes were full of tears, and she hid her face in her hands. "You mean the Garden of Death," she whispered. "Yes, the Garden of Sleep," said the ghost. "It is very beautiful. There is peace and silence. There is no yesterday and no tomorrow. Only love can open the door to the garden. You can help me. You can open for me the door of death's house, for love is always with you. And love is stronger than death." Virginia did not know what to say. There was silence. She felt as if she was in a terrible dream. Then the ghost spoke again. "Have you read the writing on the library window?" "Oh, yes," said Virginia, looking up. "I know it quite well. It is written in strange black letters, and hard to read. There are only 6 lines. If a golden girl can weep, prayer from the lips of sin, when the barren almond bears, and a little child gives away her tears, then shall all the house be still, and peace come to Canterville." "But I don't know what they mean," said Virginia. "They mean," he said, sadly, "that you must weep with me for my sins, because I have no tears, and pray with me for my soul, because I have no faith, and then the angel of death will leave me in peace." "What do I have to do?" asked Virginia. "You must come with me into the darkness. You will see strange things. You will hear strange voices, but nothing will hurt you. You are good and kind. The dark cannot hurt you." Virginia did not answer, and the ghost waited. He had waited for 300 years. This was the longest minute of all that time. "I am not afraid," said Virginia at last. "I will come with you into the dark, and I will ask the angel to have mercy on you." With a cry of joy, the ghost kissed her hand. His lips were cold like ice, hot they burned like fire. The ghost held her hand and they walked to the wall. The wall opened. There was darkness beyond the wall and a cold wind. Voices spoke out of the wind. "Go back, Virginia. Go back before it is too late." Virginia walked into the darkness with the ghost, and they disappeared through the wall. About 10 minutes after the bell rang for tea, Mrs. Otis realized that Virginia had not come down. At first, Mrs. Otis wasn't too worried. She was thinking that Virginia had gone to the garden to gather flowers. However, as time passed, and Virginia didn't appear, Mrs. Otis grew increasingly anxious. The family searched every room in the house, but there was no sign of Virginia. It was a summer evening, and the sun had not set, so the family and the servants searched the gardens before it was dark. In the garden there were many trees and a deep pond. They looked in the pond. They looked in the trees. Then they asked people at the railway station, but no one had seen Virginia. Mr. Otis went to tell the village policeman that Virginia had disappeared. But by that time, it was dark and no one could search any more that night. None of the family felt like eating or sleeping. They gathered in the library and anxiously waited, hoping for Virginia's safe return. The plan was to resume the search for her the next morning. At midnight, the family, tired and worried, decided to go to bed. As they left the library and began to climb the stairs together, all the clocks in the house struck 12, accompanied by a terrible noise. Thunder crashed outside, and a dreadful cry were heard. Strange music filled the house, and a door opened at the top of the stairs. Virginia appeared in the doorway. Her face was very pale and she carried a small box in her hand. "Where have you been?" said Mr. Otis, a bit annoyed, thinking Virginia played a trick. Mrs. Otis was thanking God for Virginia's return. Virginia said quietly, "I have been with the ghost. He is dead and now he can rest. He gave me this box of beautiful jewels before he died." Virginia led them along a secret corridor. They came to an old wooden door which was open. Beyond the door was a little room with a low ceiling. There was an iron ring in the wall and 2 chains. At the end of the chains was a body. Only bones remained. It was a skeleton. "This is the body of Sir Simon de Canterville," said Virginia. "He murdered his wife in 1575. Then his wife's brothers shut him in this room. He was given no food. Sir Simon starved to death. His ghost was in this house for 300 years. But now he has found peace." There was a funeral 4 nights later. The Otises buried the body of Sir Simon de Canterville in a grave among the trees. The following morning, before Lord Canterville left for town, Mr. Otis discussed with him the valuable jewels the ghost had given Virginia. The jewels, particularly a necklace made of red stones, were magnificent and of considerable value. Mr. Otis was not sure he wanted his daughter to keep them. Lord Canterville appreciated Virginia's courageous actions and insisted that the jewels belonged to her, emphasizing that they were not family jewels since they had been unknown until recently. He suggested that the ghost would return to haunt him if disturbed. In the end, Lord Canterville convinced Mr. Otis to let Virginia keep the jewels,